Welcome back. This is the seventh mini lecture on the Constitution. And when I left you, I was talking about how after the 7 Years' War, there was an action reaction cycle that led to revolution. I talked about the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. But you'll notice that I left a highly celebrated event off of the list. I think it's a really sexy event, but I don't think it's very important politically. In every history class that I ever took, this event was talked about. Certainly, from a historical perspective, I think it's an important event. But the event is not important in contributing to this action reaction cycle. And of course, the event that I'm talking about in 1770 is the Boston Massacre. It's a sexy event in the notion that you have bloodshed for the first time. There's alcohol and politics involved. You have British soldiers who have displaced some Boston dock workers who've gone into the local taverns and have been drinking, amongst other things. And eventually, of course, we end up with, I believe, six, if I remember my history right. It's been a while since I've heard the story, but I think it was six dead colonists. But for me, as a political scientist, this event is not important. I'm not going to test you on it. And the reason is that the political attitudes of both the colonists and the British remain the same. Both the British and the colonists believed that there was a political and diplomatic dispute, that dispute would be resolved peacefully. And so the perceptions, and remember, I've mentioned this, I believe, twice before, but it's so important, I will repeat it again. Remember, in the political world, perceptions are more important than reality. And in this particular case, the perceptions of both the British as well as the colonists remained unchanged. So scroll down to the Boston Tea Party and in your notes put a whole bunch of stars here because this event is on the exam. And this event certainly at first glance does not appear to be nearly as significant as the Boston Massacre. Nobody dies. But we have over 300 chests of tea that are tossed into Boston Harbor. And I want to give you probably a perspective on this that you've never heard before. If so, please write me because I would be impressed with your history teacher if they did. You see, today we put a priority on crimes against people rather than crimes against property. But at the time of the Boston Tea Party, there were nearly 200 crimes that could get you executed. Today in America, there's one. There's one crime that can get you executed in most states, but not all, and that's first degree murder. Now, keep in mind at this time in Britain, if I attempted to kill someone, we'd call that attempted murder. In Britain at the time, this was a misdemeanor. You could get fined for that. On the other hand, if I stole your horse, I could be executed for that. It's a property crime. Certainly today, we don't get that. Uh, every one of us would consider attempting to kill a person a far worse crime than stealing a horse. But go back to John Locke. Remember what Locke's natural rights were? Life, liberty, and property. Property was on an equal basis with life itself. And so there were many property crimes that could get you executed in Britain at the time. And the reason I bring this up is what is the Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party is a property crime. You have colonists who try to disguise themselves as Indians or as native peoples. They board these British ships and they toss these chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was a capital crime. You could be executed for this. Now, the most famous colonist that was alive in 1773 was Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin wrote an editorial. He did not use this word, but if you read his editorial, you would come to this conclusion. I think most people would. Essentially, what Benjamin Franklin said about the people who tossed the chests of tea in the harbor, these people were terrorists. Franklin says that the British should be given a full apology, and the British should be given full restitution for the loss of their property, in this case, tea. Obviously, many people disagreed with Franklin, but the significance of this event is in your notes. And the significance of this event is that it hardened the perceptions. It changed those perceptions that I'm telling you are so important, making revolution much more likely. King George was absolutely incensed. He began blockading the harbor. He began quartering troops in people's homes. The colonists, in some cases, the most famous example of this would be in New York City, melted down the largest statue of King George in the colonies, melted the statue down, and turned it into several thousand bullets. And shortly after the Boston Tea Party, we began having a rebellion. English citizens rebelling against their own government. Well, what changed this rebellion that lasted in 1774 and in 1775 into a revolution? What changed this internal rebellion into the first time ever that a colony separated itself from its mother country? And in this second half of this mini lecture, I want to talk about two events that you've heard of, but I don't think the first event has been given nearly enough importance or credit. It's incredibly important. It's this pamphlet called Common Sense. The author of Common Sense is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was one of Benjamin Franklin's friends. He came to the colonies kind of late in the game. He's one of these uh, troublesome immigrants. He comes from Britain and begins stirring up trouble as a pamphleteer. There were lots of pamphleteers. There were lots of people upset against British public policy. Some people didn't like the fact that the British were impressing sailors and making them work on British ships. Some people were upset because British soldiers were saying, we're spending the night here and you're going to feed us and you're going to give us lodging for the night. Other people didn't like the fact that the British were depriving people of due process in the courts as they had before. Lots of people, some people, of course, a lot of people weren't happy with the taxes. The point is there's a lot of people listing grievances against British public policy, and certainly Paine did that. But underline our star what comes next in your notes. What distinguishes Paine, what makes him so important, is that he goes beyond listing grievances and he questions the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. Now, legitimacy is the belief that one's rule is rightful, and as I have written in your notes, in other words, Thomas Paine isn't just saying King George is a bad king, right? If you believe that I was a bad ruler, you would probably do one of two things. Either one, you try to give me advice on how to become a better ruler, or you'd wait for me to die and have my son take over. As long as you think that I have the right to rule you, it doesn't matter whether you think I am a good or a bad king. If you think my rule is rightful, uh, then you're not going to have a revolution per se. But if you believe that I'm illegitimate, if you believe that I do not have the right to rule you, now you have a much, much bigger problem. And to me, once the colonists and virtually everyone was exposed to Common Sense, there were some 150,000 copies. Even though there were a lot of people who couldn't read, you have people in the town square reading this. I can see in your notes that somehow a line got omitted at the bottom of Common Sense. This is the prerequisite to the Declaration of Independence. You see, if common sense or a document much like it is not written, there is no Declaration of Independence. We had to have a widespread acceptance that King George no longer had the right to govern us. And certainly common sense planted that seed in the minds of many. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about the Declaration of Independence. I think that your notes are quite clear. I've also referred to them in a couple places under social contract theory. And I talked about all three of these. Notice as I recite these three and make just a couple of comments in the 4 minutes and 15 seconds that's left in this mini lecture, you will notice that all of these are ideas of Locke. I told you earlier that Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, our founding fathers, were social contract theorists. There are three essential ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and underline Jefferson. One of the questions that I always ask on the first exam is, who is the author of the Declaration of Independence? You should know Jefferson. Take a look at the three ideas. First, people are endowed with certain God-given rights. Locke called these natural rights. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, calls them inalienable rights. As I mentioned earlier, for Locke, the natural rights of the people were life, liberty, and property. As I mentioned earlier, the delegates at the Congress debated this point, did not believe that property was a natural right. They believed that property was a social right. So the Declaration of Independence was amended to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But notice the emphasis on natural rights. Now, obviously, according to social contract theory, the purpose of government is to perform a task, right? And in this case, the primary purpose of the government, according to Locke and Jefferson, are to protect the natural rights of the people. The second major point is that government gets its authority from the consent of the governed. Both Locke and Hobbes referred to this as the social contract. And third and most important, remember that in a contract, both parties have obligations. And if a party does not fulfill their obligation, then the other party has recourse. So in this case, if the primary purpose of the government is to protect the natural rights of the people, which is what both Locke and Jefferson are telling us, then the people have the right to revolt if their rights are taken away. So this claim takes up about 75% of the document. Notice that Jefferson repeatedly claims he, King George. In reality, it is not only King George, but it is also the British Parliament, the British Congress, that is taking away these rights. But Jefferson repeatedly claims that he has deprived us of our rights in numerous ways. He's taxed us without representation. He has blockaded our harbors. He has quartered troops in our homes. He's impressed sailors on his ships. He's interfered with our commerce and numerous others. But essentially, the Declaration of Independence is a legal claim against the British government. It is, for the first time in the history of the world, political philosophy. It is turned into political propaganda, and in this case, legitimizes a revolution. And so the American Revolution is a Lockean revolution. It is rooted in social contract theory, and it is a claim by the people. We, the people. It is a claim that we, the people, have had our rights taken away by this government. It is not the government that gives us our rights. It is we, the people, that give government its power, and you have abused it, and therefore we are separating our bonds with you. What an interesting and provocative concept, and a first in the history of the world. In our next lecture, we talk about the Articles of Confederation.